Part 2. Transfer of U.S. Public Lands. Understanding the pro-transfer narrative. The transfer of public lands movement is an extension of the Sagebrush Rebellion of the 1970s and 80s, which was a reaction to increased federal regulation on U.S. public lands that included the repeal of RS 2477, an 1866 federal law authorizing construction of roads across federal public lands, and passage of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976, FLPMA. FLPMA requires that the public lands be retained in federal ownership unless, as a result of the land use planning procedure provided for in the Act, it is determined that disposal of a particular parcel will serve the national interest. This concept of retention and managing for multiple use came from hundreds of BLM public hearings held throughout the West between 1965 and 1970, where the overwhelming response to these hearings was to retain and manage for multiple use. The Federal Land Policy and Management Act also phased out homesteading in the United States by repealing the various homestead acts in the lower 48 states and allowing homesteading in Alaska only until 1986. In 1976, recognizing the shift to retention of U.S. public lands in federal ownership, Congress created the Payment in Lieu of Taxes Program, PILT. The PILT program, when properly funded, provides payments to counties and other local governments to offset losses in tax revenues due to the presence of substantial acreage of federal land in their jurisdictions. Reacting to all these changes, supporters of the Transfer of Public Lands movement want more state and local control over U.S. public lands, if not outright transfer of them to state and local authorities, and/or privatization, which is reflected in the actions taken by the Utah legislature. In addition to the Transfer of Public Lands Act, members of the Utah legislature have sponsored dozens of bills and resolutions to facilitate the transfer of public lands from federal to state ownership. These bills and resolutions are titled Public Lands Litigation and Eminent Domain Authority, Concurrent Resolution on Transfer of Public Lands Act and Interstate Compact on Transfer of Public Lands, Commission for the Stewardship of Public Lands and Private Donations for Public Lands Litigation, and Concurrent Resolution to secure the perpetual health and vitality of Utah's public lands and its status as a premier public lands state. In 2015, a legal analysis on public lands, tasked with evaluating alternative legal theories that Utah may use in court to gain ownership of and/or control over U.S. public lands, concluded that legitimate legal theories exist to pursue litigation. However, the Supreme Court has read the property clause of the U.S. Constitution broadly in an unbroken line of cases, never finding any limit to congressional power over public lands. The Court has made clear that the U.S. may own and regulate federal lands and that state laws may not conflict with federal law. The Equal Footing Doctrine's application to property is limited to submerged lands. Apart from these lands, the Equal Footing Doctrine applies only to political rights, guaranteeing states equal sovereignty. The Enclave Clause applies to lands that states once owned, but Utah never owned the lands at issue under the Transfer of Public Lands Act. And the Compact Theory relies on the false premise that the Utah Enabling Act included a promise to dispose of federal lands. The One Utah Roadmap, recently released by Governor Cox and Lieutenant Governor Henderson, outlines policy priorities and suggested action items. It too contains confusing and conflicting language about U.S. public lands in Utah. Under economic growth and diversification, marketing and promotion of rural tourism is highlighted, yet under public lands, opposition to enlargement of national monuments is listed. Under natural resources, the roadmap includes creating a state coal and petroleum reserve system and mineral reserve system. But since the federal government owns subsurface mineral rights on U.S. public lands, it is unclear where these reserves will be established. Also, when the roadmap talks about local management of Utah's public lands, it is unclear exactly what is meant. Currently, U.S. public lands are owned and managed by the federal government. Utah state lands are owned and managed by the state of Utah. Current requests for appropriations by state lawmakers to the Natural Resources, Agriculture, and Environmental Appropriations Subcommittee dealing with public lands also highlight the ongoing efforts to address the public lands issues in Utah. These RFAs include public land education, a $1 million one-time request to be provided to the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office for educating the public about how the state of Utah cares for lands and supports multiple use. Protection of Utah natural resources and public lands, a one-time general education fund request of $20 million, of which $18 million will be placed into the litigation restricted account, $1 million will go to the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office, and $1 million to the Constitutional Defense Council. And the Kane County Bellwether RS 2477 lawsuit, another one-time general education fund request to include $1 million funding for the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office to support ongoing litigation. Like the One Utah Roadmap, which hopes to pursue specific goals on U.S. public lands, the request for appropriations to help educate Utahns about the public lands issues in their state must also deal with the overarching question of who owns the U.S. public lands in Utah. State lawmakers clearly recognize the need to answer this question, as year after year they discuss taking the federal government to court to determine the rightful owner of U.S. public lands in the state. In 2018, the Commission for the Stewardship of Public Lands recommended that the legislature pursue, with all due haste, litigation regarding the transfer of public lands to the state. In 2020, the Constitutional Defense Council voted to direct the Governor's Office, the Attorney General, and the legislature to work together toward a judicial resolution of the land transfer question. And most recently, on January 21, 2021, State Representative Brian King asked representatives from the Public Lands Policy Coordinating Office for an opinion on taking the 2012 Transfer of Public Lands Act litigation to the Supreme Court. Because until that question is settled, all of the legislative efforts, which have been time-consuming and expensive and have gone virtually nowhere, will continue to consume the public space to the detriment of discussions about how to address the numerous issues with U.S. public lands, from adequate PLP payments to the role Americans want U.S. public lands to play in the 21st century. Let's take a listen to what Representative King had to say.
Is this Representative King?
Yes.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Reg, Tony, thanks for coming before us today. I wanted to ask you specifically, Tony, you say you need more attorneys. I don't have a problem with that idea, but what I wanted to ask you about, and you and I have talked about this a little bit on the Constitutional Defense Council. Back in 2012, we had HB 148 passed. This ties into Representative Lyman's comments, I think. That was the Utah Transfer of Public Lands Act. And we expected that wonderful things would happen when we had, on that particular front, and I'm speaking now for the legislature as a whole, not for myself, but from the legislature's perspective as a whole and the bill being passed, we expected that wonderful things would happen in 2017 with President Trump in the White House, Republicans controlling Congress, and that there would be action that favored movement forward in transferring public lands. Nothing happened. We now have a Supreme Court which, from our perspective, it seems to me, again, speaking from a legislative perspective, not a personal perspective, is about as favorably disposed to go with us when that question about the constitutionality and the propriety of the Utah Transfer of Public Lands Act comes before it as anybody. as any Supreme Court that we've had in my lifetime, I want to see that presented and ruled on by the federal judiciary. And specifically, I vote in favor. I'm expressing my personal opinion, but I think it would probably be joined by most of my colleagues here in the legislature, that we present that issue as a matter of litigation to the federal judiciary and have it appealed to the United States Supreme Court and ruled on. And the reason for that is this is an important issue. The majority of the legislature feels strongly that there ought to be this transfer of public lands from the federal government to the state. And while I personally think that that is not likely to succeed, I do think it's in the interests of Utahns and the interest of this legislature to have that issue presented in the federal judiciary and to have a ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court in a way that disposes of it one way or the other moving forward. That's in the interests of Utahns. It's in the interest of putting this legal theory to bed once and for all, for better or worse. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a decision that the legislature and the executive branch need to make. If we're directed to proceed with such litigation, we can do that. But we need a directive from certainly Governor Cox and Attorney General Reyes, and also from the legislature.
Thank you. I'll do what I can to move the ball down the field for those individuals to give you the authority that you need. I appreciate the fact that you've said that, Tony. I think you're right. I don't think that unilaterally you can take that action, but I think that if the governor and the legislative leaders and the attorney general give you the thumbs up, that's something that we can and should do with all due haste.
Join the conversation. What happens to U.S. public lands in Utah, and by extension, the other western states, should be of interest to all Americans, because these lands will remain in public ownership only if the American people let their elected officials know that they support retention of these lands under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Make retention of U.S. public lands in federal ownership a campaign issue. Ask those who represent your interests. Should U.S. public lands continue to belong to all Americans, or should they be transferred into state ownership? Should the Antiquities Act be rescinded so no more public lands can become national monuments through presidential proclamation? Should Utah legislators bring the public land transfer case to the U.S. Supreme Court? Start the conversation. Share the Public Lands Project webpage with people you know. Help raise awareness across your community and across the country about the threat to U.S. public lands posed by the transfer of public lands movement. Because in the immortal words of Teddy Roosevelt, here's your country. Cherish these natural wonders. Cherish the natural resources. Cherish the history and romance as a sacred heritage for your children and your children's children. Do not let selfish men or greedy interests skin your country of its beauty, its riches, or its romance. In closing, thank you to the federal agencies who manage our public lands and to the many authors whose words were used in this presentation and in the Transfer of Public Lands Movement educational study. Their works are referenced in the written study, along with the maps and historic photos, and are included on the Public Lands Project webpage, while photos for this presentation came from agency websites, personal files, and downloadable photo sites.